Are you having a hard time figuring out what to get Dad for Father's Day? Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1 and save 15% off your order when you check out Row 1 Brand's Vintage Sports Pictorium Gallery. They have America's best sports art. With over 7,200 historic sports prints, you're assured to find something unique for Dad this Father's Day. If he's an NFL buff, check out the 1963 vintage NFL helmet poster. Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1.
Amos Otis. He is third on the Kansas City Royals with 193 career home runs, third in RBIs, third in hits, second in runs scored, and second in stolen bases. And yet, when you think of the greatest Royals, for many, George Brett, Hal McRae, Brett Saberhagen, and Willie Wilson are the first to come to mind. But the first real superstar to ever play for the Royals was Amos Otis. Next on Sports Forgotten Heroes, we'll take a look back on the career of this defensive genius who was also a star with his bat.
This is Sports Forgotten Heroes, a tribute to the stars who shaped the games we love to watch and the games we love to play. Stars who provided us with many thrills, but when their time was up, they faded away. We'll take a look back at their spectacular careers, their moments of fame, even if it was just for one season or just one game. And now, here's your host, Warren Rogan.
Welcome to Sports Forgotten Heroes. You know, some of the greatest players to ever play the games we love to watch are just so unassuming. They are easily forgotten or overlooked. And it's in every sport, from guys like Randy Jones of the San Diego Padres, who won the Cy Young in 1976, to quarterback Frank Ryan of the Cleveland Browns, who led the team to an NFL championship, to Randy Smith, who played for the NBA's Buffalo Braves, to Bob Bourne of the New York Islanders. There are so many, and today we're going to talk about one of the most underrated and overlooked superstars to play for the Kansas City Royals, Amos Otis. And joining me in just a moment to talk about Amos will be Bill Lamberty, a longtime member of SABR, the Society for American Baseball Research, and a lifelong fan of the Kansas City Royals. First, though, a few notes beginning with this. At the top of each episode of Sports Forgotten Heroes, after my tease, the voice you hear is that of Zach Miller to introduce the show. A terrific voiceover talent and announcer, just an all-around great guy, Zach passed away recently, and rather than replace the show open, I'm going to keep it in honor of Zach and to help his legacy live on. Rest in peace, Zach. You'll be missed. Thank you to Henry R. and Jack K. for your continued support, and to the folks over at Hungry Cliff and Hearthcast for their continued support as well. If you'd like to show your support for Sports Forgotten Heroes, suggest a forgotten hero you'd like to hear about, or have any comments about the podcast, please visit sportsfh.com. There you can learn more about our guests and the stars we talk about. Follow Sports Forgotten Heroes on Twitter at SportsFHeroes, or look for the Sports Forgotten Heroes page on Facebook. Today we're talking about Amos Otis. Originally drafted by the Red Sox and then the Mets, Otis had a cup of coffee with the Mets in 1967 and then again in 1969, their miracle year, before being traded to the Royals prior to the 1970 season. That first season with Kansas City, he played in 159 games, hit .284, stole 33 bases, and led the league in doubles with 36. He was a fixture in the Royals lineup for 14 years. As I had mentioned earlier, Bill Lamberty from SABR is here today to talk about Amos Otis. Lamberty has written 5 biographies for SABR's Biography Project, and now here's our conversation about Amos Otis. Bill, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Warren. It's a pleasure to be here.
You know, the Biography Project is really terrific. What intrigued you about Amos Otis, and how long did it take you to write his biography?
Well, I've been a Royals fan since the beginning. I was 5 and 6 years old. I turned 6 late in the summer of '69, and so that's been my team. And unlike most kids, Amos Otis was actually my favorite player. He was a guy that I don't know. I've always been a huge fan of players that kind of fill up all the stats columns, as you'd say in basketball, that
Sure.
do maybe a lot of things well, but maybe not any one thing spectacularly well. And so he was a guy I just kind of latched onto, and I lived in Nebraska, so I didn't get to a lot of games, but I loved sitting out there in the right field bleachers and chanting AO, and a lot of fun. And he gave us a lot of thrills. I mean, he was a heck of a player.
He sure was. Very cool to be able to write about one of your heroes from your childhood. Who are some of the other players you've written about?
Sam Crawford is Wahoo Sam is a player from about 20 miles from my hometown, a town, Wahoo, Nebraska, obviously, where a lot of I had some relatives there. And so I wrote a short bio about him, and a gentleman named Roy Thomas from right around the turn of the 19th, 20th century, who was a really interesting guy, played for the Phillies for many years. He was actually the player who, it was his bat work that kind of led to the fair foul rule of foul balls counting as strikes until 2 strikes, because he could just, in the early days before foul balls counted as strikes, he could stand there and foul pitches off all day. And
wow,
so,
interesting.
Yeah, he's a pretty interesting dude. But those are the guys. And then I've got one in the works. I've got one in the works on Sloppy Thurston, Hollis Thurston, who pitched in the 20s and 30s. He was actually born in my hometown of Fremont, Nebraska, and then Kenny Williams, who was the first 30-30 man for the St. Louis Browns back in the 20s.
Wow. Cool stuff. Really interesting. Hey, so let's turn our attention, though, to Amos. First of all, I got to say, I find it amazing that I've spoken to several people who are big-time baseball fans and have been for years and years and years, and they have no clue who Amos Otis is. Actually, I find it stunning, since he played relatively not that long ago, the 70s and the 80s. Tell me about Amos Otis and his skills on the field. What kind of ball player was he?
Well, I always thought he was a little bit, he was a really good metaphor for the Royals teams he played on, because he was, like I said earlier, he really did a lot of things well. He was Kansas City's first real all-star in his early years. Very good at getting on base, very good at running the bases, high stolen base guy, led the league in steals a few times. He stole his way around the bases once, kind of famously. So he was kind of a speed guy very early in his career, but the power developed a little bit, but he was pretty much the minute he moved to center field, once he reached Kansas City, he was just a terrific defensive center fielder.
There are fans of 2 teams that certainly know who Amos is. Of course, the Royals, and sadly so, the New York Met fan. I'm a lifelong Mets fan, and there are 2 ball players who, when I hear their names, they make me cringe. Jim Fregosi and Joe Foy. Tell me about Joe Foy and his connection to Amos Otis and the New York Mets.
Well, that was the gentleman that went to New York from Kansas City. And, it's funny. I've never really, and the Mets, I'm sure you know this, but the Mets had that just a black hole and abyss at third base.
Sure.
They just could not get that filled in the early years of their existence, and so they tried Amos Otis there. He was, I think, drafted as a shortstop, but he would have been one of those players that would have easily transitioned to the outfield, maybe even in the minors, except for that desperate need the Mets had at third base. But he was kind of a guy without a position, because the Mets were very well stocked in the outfield. Joe Foy started his career in Boston as a 26-year-old. He had a really nice season for Kansas City in '69. His only year with the Royals, Had about, I think, 110 OPS plus. Some very nice stats. He was a player that looked like he was just coming into his prime. And I've got to be honest, Warren, you probably know more about his career after Kansas City than I do. But, I kind of lost track of that. But I don't really understand why he never panned out, because he had a couple decent years in Boston earlier in his career. But, of course, what happened with Amos Otis is pretty evident and pretty historic, as to say.
Sure. All I can always say about Jim Fregosi and Amos Otis and Joe Foy and Nolan Ryan, what were the Mets thinking?
Right. Well, every franchise has those trades that go desperately bad, but it's just having read some of the articles discussing the trade at the time, Sporting News and that sort of thing, it was not a trade that was panned. I mean, there was really no one that thought it was. Now, Amos Otis had a couple of, he flashed well in New York a couple times, but it was not a trade that made people say, "Oh man," or "Wow, look what we got." It was a little bit of more of an afterthought kind of thing, kind of a lottery ticket, maybe on both.
Sure. It's in retrospect that the Mets and Met fans can look back and go, "Oh my gosh!" But at the time, you're right, and based on his performance and his inability to hit when he was with the Mets, you sort of can't blame them. He was an outfielder, and they tried to switch him to third base, and it just didn't work out. Tell me about his years with the Mets, particularly his days with the farm teams in Jacksonville and Tidewater.
Well, he was, like I say, a very speedy guy, very athletic guy, and of course he was from Mobile, Alabama, and the Mets had a good history of mining Mobile mining the state of Alabama, I believe. Jones and Agee were both from down there, and
Sure.
So he was considered a decent prospect, not a no-miss guy by any means, but he had some very good offensive years for the Mets down on the farm.
When he got to Kansas City, his manager at the time was not Whitey Herzog, but he knew Whitey Herzog from his years with the Mets. And Whitey Herzog saw the talent that Amos possessed. In fact, he called Amos an untouchable. And man, was he thrilled when he became the manager of the Royals that Amos was already there. Can you tell me a little bit about the relationship between Whitey Herzog and Amos Otis, what Whitey saw in Amos, and what made him say that Amos wasn't untouchable?
I think what he saw was that smooth athleticism that he really became known for. And Amos Otis was just so, he wasn't the kind of electric, explosive athlete that a lot of times we think of when we think of the 70s. He was really, really smooth. And I think that's one of the things that Whitey Herzog really most appreciated about him was just the steadiness and the consistency. And, he, as soon as he got to KC in 70, he hit 36 doubles, and he was always kind of a doubles hitter in terms of his power. I think his career high in home runs was 26 in 73, but that 1970 season, he really blossomed, and that was his first year in KC, and it was he was about, I think he was 23 that year, maybe turned 24, and he just really kind of exploded onto the scene. And I think Whitey Herzog may have been just about to become the manager in Texas then.
Right.
Or maybe was the manager in Texas, but
and they weren't that good.
Yeah, and they were struggling, but knowing what we all came to know about Whitey later in his time with Kansas City and with St. Louis, that would obviously be a pretty good match between Amos Otis and Whitey Herzog.
Now help me understand this part. I don't understand this. Amos was originally drafted by the Red Sox as a shortstop. Mm-hmm. What happened with the Red Sox? How was the game structured back then? How was it that he went from Boston and then was drafted by the Mets? I'm not understanding that.
Well, it would be a loophole a little bit similar to what we know now as the Rule 5 draft. It wasn't that formal, but teams would have to designate certain players, and other players would be available, and so the Mets were able to pick him out of the Red Sox farm system.
And he probably wasn't that upset because he really didn't have a good time in the Red Sox farm system. In fact, he played in the Appalachian League for a team in Harlan in Kentucky, and he was a victim of some racial harassment. Can you tell us about that?
Well, he was, yeah, and as we came to learn later, there are great stories about Amos Otis and some of the dudes in Kansas City that would have discussions, heated, very political-centric discussions with a guy that helped run the Royals broadcast operations that we'd all come to know later as Rush Limbaugh. And so,
wow.
So that kind of illuminates the nature of the 60s and 70s that were just very, civil rights was not something that was taken for granted by any stretch of the imagination. He was probably in high school when LBJ signed the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act. And so, this would have been very much, for that generation of African Americans, would have been very much a topic at the forefront of their thoughts, probably their conversations. And so, yeah, in the minor leagues, he did encounter some racial discrimination, and it, as you hear about a lot of young players from the South that were sort of, in their communities, living in a little bit of a cocoon where Jim Crow was still very much a thing. This would have been a major shock for a lot of those kids.
Sure. So tell me again, how was Rush Limbaugh involved?
He was very early in his career. He was, I can't remember his exact title. He was something like broadcast services director for the Royals. So he would work with the Royals radio network and would line up affiliates, that sort of thing. So he was in the front office, and he was enough of a fan, so to speak, that he was known to be around a lot, interacted with the players. That 30, 40 years later, I guess we know what Rush Limbaugh has developed into. But a lot of what you read, he was just a spirited young guy who always had a taste for conversation and debate.
Interesting. So the Mets get him in the 66 draft, and he advances through the minors quickly, making it to the Mets AAA team in Tidewater in 1967. And there was no doubt that this guy had talent. In fact, he had such talent, I read where the Mets were so high on him that they turned down a trade for Joe Torre of the Atlanta Braves because Atlanta wanted Amos Otis. Just how good was he? To be, when you're turning down Joe Torre for not to give up a minor leaguer for Joe Torre, that says a lot.
And I don't have the timeline right in front of me. It seems to me, as I recall, that there was a front office change, and of course, Gil Hodges came on board with the Mets also, and so if I'm remembering right, there was just sort of a change of opinion as he actually showed some things in that 1967 season when he reached the majors. He played pretty well defensively. He played primarily in the outfield that year. I think he played 19 or 20 games in the outfield and only one at third base, and mostly played in the outfield when he came back up in 69. But he hit 220 and showed a little bit of pop, hit a couple of doubles in that first trial, and then when he was, if I remember right, he started with the Mets at the very beginning of the season, and then was farmed out, and was then the next year in '68 when he didn't make the team out of the spring and was never called up. As I remember it and understand it from my readings, he never really got over that. He was bitterly disappointed and sort of held a grudge a little bit through the remainder of his career about that.
So why did the Mets finally agree to let him go? And for all people, Joe Foy. So they didn't want the third baseman Joe Torre, but they allowed him to go for Joe Foy.
Yeah, as I remember, there was some front office changeover in the Mets, and maybe Amos Otis' star dimmed a little bit in those next couple of years in the minors. But I think that what really happened was that New York just kind of found itself without, an idea about how to use him. I mean, I think that it was probably pretty obvious that he was not going to be able to develop as an infielder, as a third baseman. And in the outfield, it was just a pretty well-stocked team at that point in time with Swoboda and AC and Cleon Jones, and then there was more young talent coming. And I think it was a little bit of a numbers game in the Mets outfield, and I think that it was a little bit of a maybe his star faded, dimmed just a little bit.
He was a cornerstone of what turned out to be an outstanding team in Kansas City. Tell us a little bit about the Royals. They were not a typical expansion team in that they were pretty good right from the start.
Well, they had a general manager named Lou Gorman, and he would go on and work in the Boston front office. But Bill James, I remember very famously, and I read Bill very early on. He was down in Kansas, and so just being a few hours north when I was in high school, we kind of heard of him. And so my group of friends, as baseball fans, we knew of Bill James very early on, and he once called Lou Gorman the Flim Flam Man. He had an incredible run of trades. Got John Mayberry for next to nothing, Freddie Patek, Cookie Rojas. I mean, he assembled that team that was so good in the mid-'70s, and boy, he did not give up very much. He had a great knack of finding guys on his own roster that had what would amount to their only good year in the majors and turning those players into really good young players on the rise. So those teams, and Amos Otis, in a lot of ways, was the best of that process. He was the youngest when he came to Kansas City. Mayberry was a little older. Rojas was a very veteran player towards the end of his career by then. Freddie Patek, kind of the same things. But those players, like Amos Otis, they were all kind of liberated from situations where they just weren't going to get an opportunity to play every day. And boy, I'm telling you, when Lou Gorman and Joe Burke, those guys in the early front office, of course, John Shearholtz was a scout for the Royals from the beginning, from about 1969. When they assembled those guys, man, it's hard to imagine a collection of dudes clicking any better than they did. And of course, they made a couple of real astute draft choices. Steve Busby, before they finished off the process of ruining his arm, and Dennis Leonard turned into a great pitcher. Right. Paul Splittorff was one of the very first players that the Royals ever drafted. Larry Gurr came over from the Yankees because he just could not get along with Billy Martin, and he was just a great building block for those Royals rotations. So just a real interesting process of putting together a bunch of guys that really hadn't been appreciated or given an opportunity where they were.
And they had an academy or a minor league team prior to entering the league in '69, did they not?
Yeah, Ewan Kaufman maintained until the day he passed that had he kept that academy going, the Royals would have been an untouchable force. And he might be right. That academy, it was only alive for about 3 years, but it produced U.L. Washington, Ron Washington, Frank White. Basically, the idea was to take athletic kids, and many of them were from the inner city, and give them an environment that was basically like a baseball college.
Interesting.
They'd go down to Florida. The name of the town escapes me now. Maybe it was Fort Myers, but they'd go down to Florida. They lived in dorm-like buildings, and they were just drilled in baseball fundamentals, and they were just sort of just surrounded by baseball all the time. And Sid Thrift was one of the people that operated that academy. And, it was just it was an idea it would remind you a lot of what all the major league teams have going now in the Dominican, with the Dominican academies.
Sure.
But it was just a terrific operation, and it was a little bit costly, and it was just kind of, it was really derided, honestly. I mean, people around baseball really made fun of it until after it had been shut down. All of a sudden now there are a few major leaguers, and a little bit surprising to me that, no one ever tried to replicate it. Ewing Kauffman didn't push the envelope, or push all of his cards to the middle of the table or whatever. But it certainly was, in hindsight, it was a very successful venture. It probably didn't seem that way at the time, but it was a really kind of a groundbreaking proposition.
Interesting. Back to Amos. So he gets to Kansas City, and it turned out to be a great thing for him. There weren't really expectations out of the Royals their first couple of years, and they allowed Amos to continue to develop at the major league level. At his first year, he was solid. He hit .284, and as you alluded to earlier, he led the American League in doubles with 36. Tell me about those first few years with the Royals and how he established himself.
Well, and he was Kansas City's first legitimate All-Star, I believe, in 1971. He was actually, picked as a legitimate All-Star rather than being the one guy who, the Kansas City's one designee. But he was a star in Kansas City right away. He had a flair on the bases, really ran the bases well, had very good speed, kind of had the hair, kind of a little bit of an afro, and so he was pretty recognizable. But the baseball fans in Kansas City, and now you've got to remember, they put up with such lousy teams with the Kansas City A's for all those years, from the time Arnold Johnson purchased the Athletics from the Mack family and moved them to Kansas City. They were just so bad. And when Charlie Finley came, he was such an outrageous guy, and his act just was so antithesis to the Midwest. I mean, I can't imagine, having spent so many years watching games in that town, what it must have been like to watch.
That was a quick turn too, from the Kansas City A's to the Kansas City Royals, was it not? It was only like a year or two after Kansas City left for Oakland that they gave Kansas City a new team with the Royals. Was that not pretty quick?
Yeah, the A's left after the 1966 season, and that was you were just starting to see the guys that were going to form the dynasty in Oakland, those three straight World Championship teams. Reggie Jackson was up, and Campy Campaneris, and so that was, just as soon as Kansas City was going to have a interesting, good team to cheer for, Charlie Finley moved them out to the Bay. So,
and why was that? Was
right.
it because of attendance? Why was Kansas City moved to Oakland?
No, in fact, I think famously the Kansas City fans, I think the story goes that the last couple weeks of the season, after it was already clear that Finley was going to move the team, filled Old Municipal Stadium night after night just to kind of send the message that, hey, this clown's leaving, but we deserve baseball here. And it was a feud over the facility. Municipal Stadium by then was failing. It was a decades-old minor league park that had been built up like so many of the ballparks then, and so it was really only about the facility.
So again, back to Amos. How underrated or understated or unassuming was Amos? As I did my research for this edition of Sports Forgotten Heroes and looked at different fan sites for the Royals and other places too, there's very little written about him. Why is that? Why is Amos Otis not as well known as Hal McRae or Frank White or Willie Wilson? I even saw one fan site that says Amos Otis might be one of the most underrated players in Royals history. He wouldn't quite be on the Royals' Mount Rushmore, but he would be pretty damn close. The guy played for the Royals for 14 years and is still in the team's top 3 in home runs, RBIs, stolen bases. He was a stud fielder. What didn't he do?
You know, he is on my Mount Rushmore of Royals greats. I think that he's, you know, even after the players that are currently there now, even after the dust settles on their careers a little bit, I think Amos Otis will always be. He and Busby were the first 2 members of the Hall of Fame, and you know, he was really a very private person. He was very, whereas a lot of those guys really embraced the community, the Rojas's and the Pateks, even John Mayberry before he had his drug issues. You know, Amos Otis, I think, always went home to Alabama in the winter. He was just, you know, he's just not a real outgoing character. He was a little bit sullen sometimes, and I think if I'm remembering right, he was accused of pouting some when he was on the farm with the Mets, and you know, and hey, guys grow up at different rates. We all do that, and we all know that. But I think that I've got a friend who's actually our radio play-by-play man. He grew up in Wichita, and he's a Royals fan, but he's about 20 years younger than me, and he asked just a couple weeks ago if anyone. If George Brett was the Royals' first star, and Amos Otis was really the Royals' first star, and
Sure.
Of course people that remember him, you know, are older now, and you've had some great players pass through there since then. Not a whole lot in the 10 years or so before this current group was assembled, but you know, Carlos Beltran, Johnny Damon. I mean, the Kansas City Royals have continued to produce some talent, but boy, I think you could make a really good case that Amos Otis is one of the 3 or 4 great position players that organization has ever put on the field.
And he was pretty good in the postseason, too. His first at-bat in the 1980 World Series, he hits a home run, has a .295 career postseason batting average. It's consistency. The guy was as consistent as they came.
Really consistent. And I'll tell you what, Warren, I can still feel the sickness in my stomach when he hit first base. You know, the very first at-bat the Kansas City Royals ever had in the postseason was the 76 ALCS, Royal Stadium. I was so excited. I was about 13 years old, and my favorite player wrecked his ankle going across first base. Amos Otis, Whitey had moved him to leadoff, which he'd rarely done in since his very early years in Kansas City, and trying to beat out a ground ball, and he severely sprained his ankle and was lost for the postseason. And you know, that's still just such a bitter thing for me, because you know, I just still feel like they would have beaten the Yankees if Amos would have been healthy for that series. But you know, he just as his career passed, he was sort of surpassed in the limelight and in the hearts of Kansas City by George Brett, and
Right.
you know, which is understandably so. And then Brett went on to such a long career, and you know, John Mayberry, who was his exact contemporary, would hit just monstrous home runs. And you know, even then, 45 years ago, you know, you always your eyes always go to the guy that can hit the long ball, and so I just kind of think it was Amos's lot to always be a little bit overshadowed. You know what I mean?
Lou Gehrig to Babe Ruth, just on another level.
Right.
You know, Royals management knows how good he was and what he meant and what he means to the franchise. And as you stated before, along with Steve Busby, he was one of the first 2 selected into the team's Hall of Fame. But again, he's so understated. He didn't even get 1 vote for Cooperstown. Now, I'm not saying that he should be enshrined in Cooperstown, but he did put up some pretty darn good career numbers, a .277 career batting average, 342 steals, and he led the league with 52 in 1971. 3 Gold Gloves, 5 All-Stars. Again, I got to ask, why is he forgotten? In fact, you even said, now I can understand, well, not really, but I can understand why fans of other teams might not remember Amos Otis, considering all the other stars that were on the Royals. But even you said he became a somewhat forgotten ball player everywhere except Kansas City. But I can't help but think there are some Kansas Cityans who don't recall Amos Otis.
Well, I think, Warren, that the things that really rounded out his arsenal, his resume, that really gave him great value as a ball player are things that, especially then, weren't necessarily really valued. He got on base. He drew an enormous number of walks. He drew. I know he drew exactly 100 walks, kind of right in the middle of his year, his career, maybe in '76 or '77 when the Royals were really experiencing some success. But I remember and Bill James, who I referenced, he called Amos Otis his favorite player too.
Interesting.
And I remember an anecdote that in one of his very early abstracts that Bill James wrote about Amos Otis, that there was a play with men on first and second in a very important September game, and somebody hit sort of a flare into shallow center field, and Bill James wrote that it would have been very easy to make a big splashy play and dive for it, and maybe the ball might get past you on that turf or whatever. But he said Amos Otis raced up to it, let the ball drop, held the guy on second from scoring, and the Royals eventually got out of the inning without it giving up any runs. And he said it was that kind of really smart but really subtle play that really made Amos Otis a terrific player. And I agree with that. And I think that's what I always sensed, was that he just did a lot of little things. He was pretty good at taking the extra base. He was really good at, he had a very nice arm for being sort of a speed guy. I just think, like you said, what didn't he do well? I mean, he really did everything pretty well, but maybe to his detriment, didn't do any one thing spectacular.
Yeah, maybe if they had beat the Yankees in '76 or '77 or '78, one of those 3 years, it might have had a different outcome as far as his popularity.
Yeah, and also as far as getting him to the, playing a few games in the World Series in those years in terms of national exposure, because of course, if you were watching, if you're a baseball fan, then you got one game of the week, and you got to watch the teams that made the postseason. And so, baseball fans got to see him play 5 times in '76 and '77, right, and then 4 in '78. But, in those days, it was, the late '70s were a tremendously interesting time, with the big red machine kind of coming to the end of its dominance, and the Yankees rising, the Dodgers, and, the Phillies looking for their first World Series title, and, Kansas City is the expansion startup. And the Houston Astros were a really exciting team. I mean, it was the Milwaukee Brewers, Harvey's
right,
Wallbangers were kind of coming in. So I don't know. I just have such fond memories of teams and personalities from that era. And I think that maybe, by getting to the World Series, the baseball public may have been able to watch Amos Otis a little more and appreciate him. But I kind of think maybe it was, a lot of it had to do with, just his skill set, because, I keep coming back to, he did so many things well, but didn't have that one freaky raw tool, like some of the National League outfielders. You remember Gary Maddox and,
right,
Greg Luzinski hitting bombs, and maybe didn't have that one thing that people really latched onto in their memory.
After his playing days were over, he did coach a little, but never really went anywhere. Why is that? Tell me about his post-playing days and what he's doing today.
Well, I'm not sure I know a lot about it. I know he had some business ventures he was involved with. I do know that that today he lives in Las Vegas. He's lived there for many years, and he has kind of been, I don't want to say welcomed back into the Royals family, because I don't think he was ever not welcomed, but I know that he's become a little bit more public, back in Kansas City now. The radio station I listen to a radio station in KC every morning to get my Royals fix, but they've really done a good job of kind of looping him back in, and he's back for some type stuff. And so, it's good to hear his voice. I just heard him on the radio a couple weeks ago, and it's great to, great to kind of keep up with him because of all those great players, of course, Cookie Rojas is back in Miami,
right,
doing radio, and Freddie Patek still lives in Kansas City, and John Mayberry does. Willie Aikens is back there now. So a lot of those guys, still live in KC, but I think by not living in Kansas City, maybe Amos Otis didn't do himself any favors, but it's sure fun to hear him on the radio and to sort of see his name in the public setting in Kansas City now.
That's great. In the end, why is Amos Otis one of the most important players in the history of the Kansas City Royals? And what should we all know about him?
Well, I think he is, I think the best way to say it is he was Kansas City's first star. And he was probably, the Athletics had some terrific players, Maris and so on, but, in the early days of Reggie Jackson. But those guys for the A's were always either very early in their career on their way to somewhere else, whether it be to the Yankees or, to the Bay Area, or at the very end of their career when certainly their better days were behind. Kansas City, the first star that was really Kansas City's own, I would make the case, was Amos Otis. And maybe it didn't last a super long time because along came Brett and those great guys on the, late 70s championship teams. But boy, he was a fun guy to cheer for. He was a fun guy to watch. And he was really, really a special player.
Hey, so how long have you been a member of SABR?
Oh boy, I joined the year I went away to college in 1981. So I've accidentally let my membership lapse once or twice along the way, but for the most part, I've been a member for I guess that'd be 36 years.
Wow, what is it about SABR that you find so interesting?
I love the history. The personalities. I was involved in the dead ball era committee for a long time. The term sabermetrics is applied to statistical analysis, and I enjoy reading about that, but I've never been very involved in generating knowledge in that realm. So I really have enjoyed writing and learning about, the forgotten heroes, as you'd say.
Cool. Bill, thank you so much for joining me on Sports Forgotten Heroes. Tell me again, which bio are you working on right now?
I'm working on Sloppy Thurston, and I'm working on Kenny Williams.
Interesting. I can't wait to read them. Thanks again. And hopefully you'll come back again to talk about another Sports Forgotten Hero like Sloppy Thurston. I'd love to have you back.
I'd love to, Warren. This was a lot of fun. Very, very good conversation.
Thanks so much, Bill. For his career, Amos Otis hit .277. He had 2,020 hits, 193 home runs, and 1,007 RBIs. He stole 341 bases, led the American League with a career-high 52 in 1971, and twice led the AL in doubles with his high coming in 1976 with 40. He is a 3-time Gold Glove winner and an original member of the Kansas City Royals Hall of Fame. A solid career. Incidentally, Joe Foy, the man who the Royals traded to get Amos Otis, did enjoy some good years. Overall, he played 6 seasons in Major League Baseball, spending time with the Red Sox, the Mets, and the Washington Senators. He had a career batting average of .248 with 58 home runs and 291 RBIs. Next time on Sports Forgotten Heroes, we're going to explore the history of one of the NFL's forgotten teams, yes, team, the Cleveland Rams, the only franchise in the history of football to win an NFL championship in 3 different cities. Yes, the Rams actually got their start in Cleveland, and they actually won an NFL title while playing there. That's next time on Sports Forgotten Heroes. Thank you again to today's guest, Bill Lamberty, and we'll see you next time on Sports Forgotten Heroes.
We here at the Sports History Network proudly partner with 26 podcasts, all revolving around the history of sports. But did you know that many of our hosts were sports history authors way before they started their shows? It's true. We've got Joe Ziemba, host of When Football Was Football, Joe Zagurski, host of Pro Football in the 1970s, Mark Morthier, host of Yesterday Sports, Tommy Phillips, host of Lombardi Memories, and Scott Adamson, co-host of From the 55-Yard Line. All these authors have many books for you to choose from. To check them out, go to our website at sportshistorynetwork.com/sportshistorybooks. Pick up your copy today. Soundtrack provided by Kevin MacLeod of filmmusic.io.